All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive that'll really make you think. Today, we're tackling a question you guys have been asking about. Does Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain act as a right bracket to the modern era, with Goethe's Faust serving as the opening left bracket?
It's a pretty ambitious idea, right? Trying to see if these two huge EE works can actually help us define an entire era, like where it begins and ends.
Exactly. And here's where things get even more interesting. Our source material for this deep dive is a transcript from a German YouTube discussion from BrackwasserTV. So we're taking literary analysis and looking at it through this modern, very current lens.
What makes this even trickier is this whole concept of a right bracket. It implies some kind of closure and ending. So we're basically wrestling with the question of whether the Magic Mountain really reflects some huge EE shift that marked the end of the modern era.
Okay, before we get totally lost in all the symbolism and metaphors, can we just break down this bracket idea? I mean, what would a right bracket to an era even look like?
That's a really good question. Think of it this way. A left bracket sort of introduces all these ideas, themes, anxieties even, that end up defining a period. It's like setting the stage. Then, the right bracket would be a work that somehow shows how all those ideas ended up, how they culminated, or maybe even just fizzled out. It's a point where we look back and try to understand how those initial themes actually played out over time.
So, are we looking for echoes of Faust in the Magic Mountain, but also a sense of how those echoes changed or maybe even got resolved somehow?
Exactly. And this YouTube discussion we're looking at has some really interesting interpretations. They talk about how the Magic Mountain might even be a prophetic work, like it captures the essence of its time, even though it was written after World War I.
Wait, prophetic? Isn't that pushing it a bit?
Yeah, it might seem that way at first, but think about it. Could Thomas Mann have tapped into something fundamental about the time before the war? Something that was ending or transforming because of all that devastation? Maybe without even realizing it, he captured those anxieties and tensions that were simmering under the surface of that seemingly stable world.
Okay, I'm kind of starting to see where they're coming from. But how does this prophetic idea connect to the whole bracket concept?
Well, the YouTube discussion connects it to this really interesting idea of literature as like coagulated becoming. It's basically saying that these great literary works can capture a historical moment, like a snapshot. They
Hmm.
preserve the ideas, the anxieties, even the subconscious currents of an era.
So it's like literature is a time capsule, preserving the essence of an era, even if the author themselves doesn't totally get the bigger picture. And in this case, the Magic Mountain might be capturing those last moments before everything changed.
Exactly. And that's where the right bracket comes in. It's not necessarily a clean cut, a hard stop. It's more like a point of reflection, a way to understand how those initial Faust themes played out, how they changed, and finally came to a head when something as catastrophic as World War I happened.
Okay, so we've got these brackets, Faust on one side, Magic Mountain on the other. But we're talking about two literary giants here. I mean, Goethe and Thomas Mann, their styles, how they approach things, are they even comparable?
That's a really important point that the discussion brings up. They highlight this huge difference in how they narrate. They describe Thomas Mann as an Olympian narrator, totally objective and analytical. In The Magic Mountain, he presents his characters and their world with this very distant, all-seeing perspective, like a god looking down on us mortals almost.
That's so different from Goethe, especially his early works like The Sorrows of Young Werther. The writing there is so personal, almost confessional.
Totally. But what's fascinating is that even with these totally different styles, both authors were super engaged with the concept of Zeitalter, the idea of these distinct historical eras, each with its own unique traits. They both really grappled with how to capture what their time was really about, and you can see that in their work, even if they approached it from completely opposite angles.
So they're both trying to make sense of the world they live in, of these big historical currents, but they're using different tools, different voices to do it.
Exactly. And that's what makes comparing them so interesting. It's like looking at the same historical landscape through two completely different lenses. One is super precise, very analytical. The other is much more emotional, more intimate.
So the YouTube discussion then goes on to compare how Goethe and Thomas Mann each experienced these big historical events and how they responded to them. I guess that helps us see how those events influenced their writing, right?
Absolutely. Just think about the massive shifts Goethe lived through. The Lisbon earthquake. It really shook people's religious beliefs, the idea of a benevolent God. Then you have the French Revolution, totally upending traditional power structures, and the end of the Holy Roman Empire, redrawing the map of Europe. These were like the defining events for his whole generation.
And Thomas Mann, he witnessed the horrors of World War I. It completely shattered that 19th century faith in progress and rationality. It's like they both lived through these seismic vibe shifts, these fundamental shifts in society.
Exactly. These historical ruptures forced them to confront this same basic question. How do individuals deal with these times of massive change and uncertainty? How do we understand the world when everything we thought we knew is falling apart?
And that question echoes in both Faust and The Magic Mountain, right? Even though they approach it in totally different ways.
Exactly. And the YouTube discussion really emphasizes that these transformations aren't just about external stuff like political events. They're about internal shifts too, changes in how people see themselves and the world around them.
So it's not just wars and revolutions, it's about how those events change our thinking, our beliefs, our whole understanding of what it means to be human.
Exactly. And that brings us back to The Magic Mountain. The discussion suggests that this novel captures this feeling of a world on the verge of collapse, a society caught between enchantment and disenchantment.
Okay, this is interesting. What do they mean by enchantment and disenchantment?
Think about how the world felt before World War I. There was still this sense of wonder, of mystery, even with all the industrialization and scientific advances. But at the same time, there was this growing unease, like something wasn't quite right, like the old ways of seeing the world just weren't enough anymore.
So like a world that's losing its magic but not sure what to replace it with?
Exactly. And the YouTube discussion uses this really interesting example from The Magic Mountain. They talk about how Hans Castorp, the main character, encounters both death and eroticism, very close together up on that mountain.
Wow, that's quite a contrast. What's the point of that?
Remember, the discussion points out that in Jewish thought, the divine realm is seen as separate from life and death. So by placing those experiences together on the mountain, Thomas Mann might be suggesting a kind of reversal, where the sacred is missing, or at least hidden.
So it's like the lines between what's sacred and what's not are blurred, and that creates this feeling of unease, this disorientation. Is that part of what they mean by disenchantment?
Exactly. They tie this to the broader themes of the modern era. Rationality and scientific thought are on the rise, traditional religious beliefs are declining, and there's this growing sense of alienation from established institutions and values.
Okay, so we've got this world teetering on the edge, this feeling of a society caught between enchantment and disenchantment. But what about the mountain itself, the magic of it? Is that literal, metaphorical, or something else altogether?
That's where the YouTube discussion gets really interesting. They bring up this thought-provoking idea. The magic of the mountain might actually be ironic.
Ironic. How so?
They suggest that the real magic isn't in the story itself, but in how the novel is structured, like how meticulously crafted it is. It's like Thomas Mann wove a spell with his words, creating this world that's so rich, so layered, that it pulls you in, even though it reveals its deeper meaning slowly.
So the enchantment is in the artistry, in how skillfully man builds the story.
Exactly. It's like the magic of a beautifully made puzzle box, where each piece, each detail adds to this bigger, more profound whole. And that kind of magic just wouldn't have been possible in earlier times. It's a product of the modern era, this self-awareness and reflexivity we see in so much modernist literature.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together, but they also contrast this with the kind of magic you find in fairy tales, specifically mentioning Hans Christian Andersen. Why bring fairy tales into this?
That's a key difference they make. Unlike those Grimm's fairy tales, where good and bad are clear and there's always a resolution, Andersen's stories are more subtle. They often end sadly. They explore the darker, less clear-cut parts of human experience, which is much closer to the tone and themes of The Magic Mountain.
So the magic of the Magic Mountain isn't about happy endings or simple solutions. It's about facing how complex life is, how life and death are always intertwined, and the struggle to find meaning when the world is going through such a huge transformation.
Exactly. It's the kind of magic that stays with you long after you finish the book. The kind that makes you question what you believe and wrestle with those big questions about life, death, and what it all means.
All right, that makes sense. But where does simultaneity fit into all of this? They keep mentioning that term, and I'm not sure I fully understand what they mean.
That's a crucial concept they use to tie everything together. They're using the ideas of Søren Kierkegaard, the philosopher. He argued that we can connect with authors from different eras, like we're having a timeless dialogue with their ideas. It's like stepping out of our own historical moment and into the minds of people who came before us. We engage with their thoughts and feelings as if they were our own.
Okay, That sounds really profound. But how is that even possible? Isn't there a huge gap between us and someone like Goethe who lived in such a different world?
They say this connection is possible because literature, unlike, say, a dictionary, allows for lots of interpretations. A great work of literature is like a prism. It reflects different meanings and insights depending on how you look at it.
So it's not about finding the one right answer, but about having this ongoing conversation with the text,
Yeah.
letting it speak to us across time. And they're saying the Magic Mountain is particularly good at this simultaneity thing.
Exactly. It's a work that demands active participation from the reader. It doesn't tell you what to think. It invites you to grapple with its ambiguities, its contradictions, and to find your own understanding within its vast, intricate structure.
And this is where they link it back to the problems of the modern world, right? They're saying that we've lost something in today's society that makes this deep engagement with literature harder.
Precisely. They argue that our world now, with its focus on instant gratification and this constant flood of information, has actually eroded our ability to really engage with complex, ambiguous works like The Magic Mountain.
It's like we're so used to quick hits of information, to sound bites and tweets, that we've lost the patience and attention span to really dig into something challenging. Is that what they're getting at?
Exactly.
Mm.
They even go so far as to say that this loss of engagement with classic literature has made us less able to deal with ambiguity and navigate all the uncertainties of life. We're so used to having easy answers at our fingertips that we're uncomfortable with things being complex, nuanced, with the fact that life doesn't always have a straightforward solution.
So they're saying that reading a book like The Magic Mountain, though tough, could actually be like training for dealing with a complex world. It's a mental workout that helps us build the skills we need to navigate a world that's increasingly uncertain and ambiguous.
Precisely. It's like a mental gym for those cognitive muscles we need to grapple with ambiguity and change. And in a world that's constantly shifting, those muscles are more important than ever.
Okay, I'm seeing how this all ties together now. But they also bring up this interesting comparison between the Bible, the Magic Mountain, and the Quran. What are they doing throwing those three together?
That's where they get into the idea of ambiguity tolerance and how different cultures handle complex texts. They argue that the Bible, with all its different authors, genres, and contradictions, actually encourages a kind of ambiguity tolerance that you don't often find in texts that are more dogmatic.
Okay, so it's not about blindly accepting everything in the Bible as literal truth, but more about engaging with it as a collection of texts from different perspectives and historical moments. And that takes a certain comfort level with ambiguity, with the idea that there might not be one right answer to every question.
Exactly. And they emphasize how this is amplified by translation. Slight variations in wording can lead to different interpretations, even within the same language. They even brought up how the printing press led to this push to standardize the Bible, which some saw as a loss of that inherent ambiguity.
So they're saying that the way the Bible is structured, its multiplicity and openness to interpretation, actually fostered a more flexible way of thinking. And this contrasts with the Quran, which is often seen as more unified and definitive, with less room for individual interpretation. Am I getting that right?
Exactly. It's not about saying one is better or worse. It's about understanding how different structures can actually shape how we think, how we approach complicated ideas and situations.
Okay, I see where they're going with this.
Hmm.
But how does this connect back to the idea of the Magic Mountain as a right bracket to the modern era?
They're arguing that the Magic Mountain, just like the Bible, demands a high level of ambiguity tolerance from the reader. It doesn't give you easy answers or simple solutions. It forces you to confront how complex the human experience is, the interplay of light and dark, the constant push and pull between order and chaos.
So in a way, it's preparing us for what comes next, for a world that's even more fragmented, more uncertain, a world that needs that ambiguity tolerance they keep talking about.
Exactly. And they suggest that this ability to handle complexity, to tolerate ambiguity, isn't just some intellectual thing. It's about survival. It's what lets us adapt, evolve, and find meaning and purpose in a world that's constantly shifting.
Okay, I think I'm getting the bigger picture here. But they also bring up irony, and I'm not sure how that fits in.
They argue that irony is crucial in helping us navigate complexity and ambiguity. It's like a psychological buffer. It lets us hold these seemingly contradictory ideas in our minds without falling into despair.
So it's a defense mechanism, a way to recognize how absurd and contradictory life is without becoming cynical or nihilistic. And they're saying The Magic Mountain is full of irony.
Absolutely. Just think about the setting itself, a luxurious sanatorium for tuberculosis patients high up in the Swiss Alps. There's this stark contrast between the beautiful, serene setting and the reality of the patient's illnesses. Then you have characters like Settembrini, the rationalist, and Nafta, the Jesuit. They represent completely opposite ideologies, but are both stuck on this mountain, unable to escape their own limitations.
So the irony is, in the situation, how these characters are brought together, how they interact with each other and their surroundings. And they're saying this irony helps us see the world in a more nuanced, complex way.
Exactly. It allows us to hold multiple viewpoints at once, to see the validity in different opinions, and appreciate how inherently ambiguous life really is.
I'm starting to see how irony fits into this ambiguity tolerance idea, but they also connect this to the challenges of living in a postmodern world. What does postmodernism have to do with any of this?
They argue that postmodern thought, with its emphasis on the idea that truth is subjective and the deconstruction of grand narratives, has made it even harder to find solid meaning and values. It's like we're living in this world where everything is constantly in flux, where there are no fixed points of reference.
So it's like the ground is always shifting under our feet and we're struggling to find our balance. And they're saying this postmodern condition makes ambiguity tolerance even more crucial.
Exactly. Because if there's no objective truth, if everything is relative, then it becomes incredibly hard to find any sense of purpose or direction. We're bombarded with different perspectives, different interpretations, different ways of seeing the world. And if we don't have the skills to navigate that complexity, we risk getting overwhelmed, paralyzed, and unable to make sense of any of it.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does the Magic Mountain help us with this? It's from the modern era, not the postmodern one.
They argue that the Magic Mountain, even though it was written in the early 1900s, actually anticipates a lot of the challenges of this postmodern condition. It's deeply concerned with how meaning fragments, with the loss of certainty, with how hard it is to find a solid sense of self when the world is constantly changing.
So it's like Thomas Mann was ahead of his time. He was already dealing with issues that would become even bigger in the later 20th century.
Exactly. And they argue that by engaging with these themes in the Magic Mountain, by wrestling with its complexities, we can actually develop the skills we need to deal with the even greater complexities of the postmodern world. It's like a training ground for the soul, preparing us for the challenges ahead.
Okay, I'm really seeing how this all connects now. But they also bring up this phrase, you deviate from the path at your peril. That sounds kind of ominous. What's that about?
The famous Jordan Peterson quote. They're using it to talk about the importance of tradition, of the wisdom that's been passed down through generations. They're saying that while we might be tempted to just dismiss traditional wisdom, we do so at our own risk.
So it's like that saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because something's old doesn't mean it's useless. And they're saying the Magic Mountain reminds us of this.
Exactly. They suggest that certain patterns of human behavior, certain fundamental truths about what it means to be human, have stood the test of time for a reason. And we should approach those with humility, recognizing that they might have insights we haven't fully grasped yet.
So it's not about blindly clinging to the past, but realizing that there might be valuable lessons to be learned from those who came before us. And the Magic Mountain is a good example of a work that engages with these timeless themes, these patterns of behavior that have always been part of the human experience.
Exactly. And they even connect this to the idea of a legacy, saying that we inherit wisdom and knowledge from past generations even if we don't get it at the time. It's like we're part of this bigger chain where knowledge and values are passed down through the ages, shaping who we are and how we see the world.
Okay, I'm seeing how this all fits into the larger picture, but they also bring up this interesting connection between the Magic Mountain and what they call woke ideology. How did that even come up?
That's where it gets really interesting. They argue that this current tendency to view everything through the lens of social justice and identity politics can actually lead to a kind of rigidity and intolerance that undermines the very values it claims to support.
So it's like trying to force this complex, nuanced reality into a really narrow, predetermined box. And they're saying that can backfire, that it can actually get in the way of progress.
Exactly. They argue that it can create this kind of intellectual and emotional shutdown where people are afraid to speak up or challenge the accepted narrative for fear of being labeled as problematic. And they contrast this with the openness and ambiguity of works like The Magic Mountain, where different viewpoints are explored and debated without any easy answers or predetermined conclusions.
So it's about encouraging critical thinking, nuance, and being able to engage with different views, even those that might challenge us or make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. They're arguing that real progress, real understanding, comes from engaging with complexity, not from trying to simplify things or force them into some pre-existing ideological box. And The Magic Mountain is a perfect example of a work that embraces complexity and makes us think for ourselves.
Okay, that makes sense. But they also make this connection between ambiguity tolerance and being able to handle hardship. How are those two things even related?
They say that how well we tolerate ambiguity is directly related to our ability to deal with tough situations, to endure suffering, and to find meaning even in the face of adversity.
So it's like a muscle that we need to work out in order to be more resilient. And they're saying the Magic Mountain can help us with this.
Exactly. They suggest that by engaging with complex, challenging literature, we're actually training ourselves to be more resilient. It's a form of mental and emotional conditioning that preps us for the inevitable challenges of life.
Okay, I see the connection now. But they also mention these different psychological models, the inhibition model and the integration model. What are those and how do they relate to all of this?
They're talking about different ways we deal with negative thoughts and feelings. The inhibition model is all about suppressing or avoiding those negative experiences, trying to block them out. But the integration model encourages us to acknowledge those difficult emotions, process them, and even find meaning in them.
So it's like the difference between trying to hide from the bad stuff and actually facing our challenges head on and making them part of how we understand ourselves and the world. And they're saying the integration model fits better with the kind of ambiguity tolerance that's developed by engaging with classic literature.
Exactly. Because it recognizes that real resilience comes from facing our challenges, wrestling with those tough questions, and figuring out how to incorporate all our experiences, good and bad, into a coherent story about who we are.
Okay, that makes sense. But then they bring up the Olympian narrator again, using Thomas Mann as an example. I thought we already talked about that.
They're bringing it up again in light of this whole discussion about ambiguity tolerance and challenges of the postmodern world. They point out that this detached, all-seeing perspective is what lets man create a world that's both super intricate and also coherent. Everything has a meaning, every detail adds to the whole.
So it's like he can hold all this complexity and ambiguity in his mind and then present it to us in a way that's both challenging and ultimately satisfying.
Exactly. And they contrast this with the more subjective, fragmented style of some contemporary writers who seem more focused on their own personal experiences than on crafting a unified and meaningful story. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's a different approach.
Okay, so it's not about good versus bad, but about different approaches, different goals. Are they saying contemporary literature is just flawed or less valuable than the classics?
Not necessarily. They're just pointing out that focusing on the subjective can sometimes lead to work that's emotionally powerful, but maybe lacking in intellectual depth or lasting meaning.
So not good versus bad, but different approaches, different aims. And they're suggesting that The Magic Mountain, with its Olympian narrator and its grand scale, offers us a perspective that's often missing in what we read today.
Exactly. And they link this to the meaning crisis, arguing that this retreat into personal experience, while totally understandable, can also limit us. They say that engaging with works like The Magic Mountain, works that tackle those big questions and offer a broader view of the world, can help us reconnect with larger truths and find meaning beyond our own individual experiences.
Okay, I'm really seeing how this all comes together, but they also bring up this fascinating idea about how the structure of a text can actually shape our thinking. What do they mean by that?
They argue that reading something complex and layered, like The Magic Mountain, actually trains our minds to think in a more nuanced and sophisticated way. It's not just the content, but the mental effort it takes to decode it, to make sense of its structure.
So it's like a mental workout, but for our brains.
Right. It's like learning a new language.
Mm.
By immersing ourselves in how a complex text is put together, we're actually expanding our cognitive abilities and learning new ways to think.
And they contrast this with how passively we consume information in our digital world, where we're constantly bombarded with these short, fragmented pieces of content. It's like we're training our brains to think in sound bites and tweets and losing our ability to engage with complex ideas.
Precisely. And they argue that this passive consumption can lead to a kind of intellectual atrophy. We lose our ability to focus, think critically, and really engage with complex ideas.
So it's like we're feeding our brains junk food and we're not getting the nutrients we need to be intellectually healthy. And the Magic Mountain is like a hearty, nutritious meal that can help us get back on track.
Exactly. It's a work that demands our full attention, challenges us to think critically, and rewards us with insights that can enrich our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Okay, I'm really starting to appreciate the value of engaging with challenging literature like The Magic Mountain, but they also come back to this idea of vibe shift, arguing that we're going through a period of profound transformation and we need the wisdom of classic literature to help us navigate it.
They're pointing out that Goethe and Thomas Mann both lived through periods of massive social and political change, and their works reflect those challenges, but also the opportunities of living through those times.
So they're saying that even though the specific events might be different, the fundamental human experiences, the anxieties, the aspirations, the search for meaning are timeless and universal.
Exactly. They suggest that by immersing ourselves in the simultaneity of great literature, we can gain a deeper understanding of our own historical moment and find guidance for navigating the challenges we face.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this relates to our own lives. But they also connect this to the current political landscape, arguing that the polarization and division we're experiencing are partly due to a lack of ambiguity tolerance and an inability to have respectful conversations across ideological divides.
It's a crucial point. If we can't tolerate different viewpoints, if we're always trying to force everything into our own pre-existing boxes, then it becomes impossible to have meaningful conversations or find common ground. And the Magic Mountain, with its complex characters and its nuanced exploration of different ideologies, offers a model for how to engage in that kind of dialogue.
So it's not about agreeing with everyone, but about being willing to listen, to try to understand, to see the world through different lenses. And they're saying literature can help us develop those skills.
Exactly. It can help us cultivate intellectual humility, a willingness to learn and grow, and an appreciation for the beauty and complexity of the human experience.
Okay, I'm really seeing the power of literature in a whole new way. But they also emphasize that reading something like The Magic Mountain isn't about finding easy answers. It's about embracing the challenge, the discomfort, the ambiguity, and letting yourself be changed by the experience. It's about understanding that searching for meaning is a lifelong process, and the journey itself is just as important as where you end up.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that's the real magic of the Magic Mountain. It doesn't give us all the answers, but it helps us ask better questions, think more deeply, and see the world in a more nuanced and complex way. And in the end, it's that kind of thinking, that kind of engagement with the world that will help us navigate the challenges we face and create a better future for ourselves and generations to come.
All right, that was a lot to unpack. We've covered a lot of ground here, from coagulated becoming to how the Magic Mountain reflects a pre-war world, to time, symbolism, and how it compares to both Faust and the Bible in terms of interpretation. But this YouTube discussion had so much more to say.
They did. And before we wrap up, we should really explore what they had to say about deviating from the path, the role of woke ideology, and how those psychological models of information processing relate to embracing ambiguity. So we've kind of set up this idea of the Magic Mountain as a potential right bracket, this glimpse into a world teetering on the edge. But the book itself is just so packed with stuff. I mean, where do we even begin to see those echoes of Faust?
I know, right? It's so easy to get lost in the details, all those philosophical discussions, the sheer density of it. But the YouTube discussion we're looking at, they zeroed in on a few key things that might help us connect the dots.
One of the big ones, I think, is how both Faust and the Magic Mountain wrestle with what time is. In Faust, time is this relentless force, always pushing forward, driving Faust's ambition, and ultimately, leading to his downfall.
But up on the mountain, time seems to work differently. The YouTube discussion talked about how it becomes all warped and distorted.
Yeah, exactly. Hans Castorp gets there thinking it'll be a quick visit, and years just slip away without him even noticing. The routines, the isolation, the whole atmosphere of the sanatorium, it's like it messes with his perception of time.
It's like he steps outside of normal time, almost into a different dimension. And the discussion linked that to this bigger theme of change, especially that kind of societal vibe shift we were talking about.
Totally. The mountain becomes like a mini society that's struggling to deal with a world that's changing super fast. You have these characters who represent different ideologies, different ways of understanding this new reality, and how they interact, the debates they have. It all reflects that larger struggle.
So it's not just Hans Castorp's personal story. It's using his experience to explore these big shifts happening in society. And that's where we see those echoes of Faust, right? This idea of people grappling with forces way bigger than themselves, trying to find their place in a world that just won't stop changing.
Right on. And both Goethe and Thomas Mann, they use symbolism and the way they structure their stories to explore those themes in really powerful ways.
Speaking of symbolism, that YouTube discussion kept bringing up the mountain itself. It's obviously not just a literal mountain, is it?
Definitely not. It becomes this symbolic space, almost like a purgatory, where the characters are forced to confront like their own mortality, their beliefs, what their place is in the world.
Hmm.
And that's where the connection to Faust becomes even more clear.
How so?
Remember in Faust how knowledge is both this powerful thing, A and D, something that can lead to ruin. Faust's obsession with knowing more, it ultimately destroys him. Well, the mountain, in the Magic Mountain, it becomes this similar kind of testing ground.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. All the characters are constantly debating, exploring different philosophies, looking for answers. But that search doesn't always lead to enlightenment, does it? Sometimes it just leads to more questions, more confusion.
Exactly. That's the whole point. The mountain represents the limits of what we can know, the inherent ambiguity of life. And just like in Faust, that ambiguity can be both fascinating and terrifying.
So the mountain is both a safe haven, a prison, a place to learn A&D, a place where illusions are shattered. It's like a miniature version of the modern era with all its contradictions and complexities.
Exactly. And that's where the genius of how Thomas Mann structures his story comes in. He uses this confined space, this isolated world, to explore these huge forces that are shaping the modern world. And he does it in a way that's intellectually demanding A&D, emotionally powerful.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how this all fits together. But they also compared the Magic Mountain to the Bible. What was that all about?
They were talking about how both works kind of force us to deal with complexity and ambiguity. The Bible, with all its different writers, genres, and contradictions, it requires a certain level of ambiguity tolerance from the reader. It's not a book that gives you easy answers or simple solutions, and the Magic Mountain is kind of the same way.
So it's not just about the story itself, but how it's told, how it makes us grapple with those ambiguities and contradictions. And they're saying that this is good for us, that it actually helps us develop the mental skills we need to navigate a world that's complex and uncertain.
Exactly. And they compare this to a lot of modern storytelling, where everything is neatly wrapped up, good always wins, and there's a happy ending. They're saying these simple stories actually do us a disservice because they don't help us build the resilience we need for the real world. The Magic Mountain, because it refuses to give us easy answers, because it embraces complexity and ambiguity, is actually more helpful, even if it's a tougher read.
Okay, so it's like a mental workout. The more we engage with complexity, the stronger our minds become.
Right. And this is where they bring in Wives Shift, again, that idea of a fundamental shift in consciousness. They're saying we're going through a similar transformation right now, and we need that same ambiguity tolerance that people needed back then, during that transition from the 19th to the 20th century.
So they're saying the Magic Mountain can actually help us understand and deal with the challenges we're facing in the 21st century.
Yeah, exactly. It's a book that speaks to those basic human experiences, those struggles we all face as individuals and as a society. And by really engaging with those struggles, confronting that complexity, we can build the skills and resilience we need to thrive in a world that just keeps changing.
Okay, I'm really starting to see the value of digging into this. But the YouTube discussion also brought up this connection between the Magic Mountain and woke ideology. How did they even get there?
Well, they were talking about how this current tendency to look at everything through the lens of social justice and identity politics can sometimes lead to this rigidity, this intolerance that actually undermines the very values it's supposed to be promoting.
So it's like they're trying to force this complex, nuanced reality into a very narrow, predefined box. And they're saying that can be counterproductive, that it might even hinder progress.
Exactly. They say it can create this kind of intellectual and emotional paralysis where people are afraid to speak their minds or even consider different viewpoints because they might get labeled as problematic. And they contrast this with the openness and ambiguity of the Magic Mountain, where all sorts of perspectives are explored and debated without any easy answers or predetermined conclusions.
So it's about encouraging critical thinking, nuance, and being able to engage with different perspectives, even those that might be challenging or uncomfortable. And the Magic Mountain shows us how to do that in a way that's intellectually stimulating and emotionally engaging.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that whole idea of the Magic Mountain being a right bracket to the modern era. It captures the anxieties and aspirations of a world right on the verge of huge transformation, a world wrestling with the same fundamental questions that we're facing today.
So even though it was written over 100 years ago, it still has things to teach us about how to deal with the complexities of our world today.
Totally. That's the amazing thing about great literature. It speaks to us across time and space, offering insights and perspectives that can really help us understand ourselves and the world better. And the Magic Mountain, with all its density and complexity and the way it refuses to give us easy answers, is a perfect example of that kind of timeless wisdom.
Okay, I'm with you. But they also compared the Magic Mountain to the Quran. How did that come up?
They were comparing how different cultures and religious traditions approach truth and how to interpret things. The Bible, like we talked about, kind of embraces ambiguity and multiple interpretations, whereas the Quran is often seen as more unified, more definitive.
So they're saying that how we approach religious texts can actually shape how we think and process information.
Exactly. It's not about saying one way is better than the other. It's about recognizing how these cultural lenses shape our understanding of the world. And they argue that the kind of ambiguity tolerance you develop by reading complex texts like the Bible, that can actually be a good thing in a world that's increasingly fragmented and uncertain.
So it's like training our minds to be more flexible, more adaptable, more capable of dealing with the complexities of the 21st century. And the Magic Mountain, with its intricate structure and its refusal to provide easy answers, is like a secular version of that, challenging us to develop those same cognitive skills.
Exactly. And that brings us back to woke ideology again. They're saying that this tendency to see everything through a single ideological lens, to demand everyone agree and silence dissenting voices, is actually counterproductive to achieving social justice and progress.
So it's like they're saying real progress requires a certain amount of intellectual humility, a willingness to engage with different views, and the recognition that there's no one right answer to the complex problems we face.
Exactly. The Magic Mountain, with its nuanced exploration of different ideologies and its refusal to offer simplistic solutions, shows us how we can have these tough conversations in a way that's both intellectually honest and emotionally resonant. It reminds us that the search for truth and justice is a journey, and it requires us to be open to new ideas, to challenge our own assumptions, and to have respectful dialogue even with people who see things differently than we do.
Okay, I'm really seeing how this all ties together. But they also brought up the idea of you deviate from the path at your peril. What was that all about again?
They were talking about the importance of tradition, of the wisdom passed down to us, and how we should approach those enduring patterns of human behavior with some humility, realizing they might contain insights we haven't fully grasped.
So, like that saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because something's old doesn't mean it's worthless. And they're saying the Magic Mountain reminds us of this.
Exactly. They argue that certain patterns of human behavior, certain fundamental truths about what it means to be human, they've stood the test of time for a reason, and we should approach them humbly, recognizing that they might hold insights we haven't fully grasped yet.
So it's not about blindly clinging to the past, but about recognizing that there could be valuable lessons to be learned from those who came before us. And the Magic Mountain is a great example of a work that engages with those timeless themes, those patterns of human behavior that have always been around.
Exactly. They even connect this to the idea of legacy. They're suggesting that we inherit wisdom and knowledge from past generations, even if we don't understand it fully at the time. It's like we're part of this bigger chain where knowledge and values are passed down, shaping who we are and how we see the world.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of this fits into the big picture, but they also make this thought-provoking connection between the Magic Mountain and woke ideology. How did that even come up?
Right. They argue that this current focus on social justice and identity politics can actually lead to this rigid, intolerant way of thinking that hurts the very causes it claims to support.
So it's like trying to force a complex, nuanced reality into this narrow, predefined framework. And they're saying that can actually be counterproductive, even harmful to progress.
Exactly. They suggest that it can lead to this intellectual and emotional paralysis where people are afraid to speak up or question things for fear of being labeled as problematic.
Okay, I get their point. But how does the Magic Mountain offer a different way?
They contrast that rigid woke ideology with how open and ambiguous a work like The Magic Mountain is, where it invites us to grapple with tough questions without giving easy answers.
So it's about promoting critical thinking, nuance, and the ability to engage with different viewpoints, even those that might be challenging or uncomfortable.
Precisely. They're saying that true progress in understanding comes from engaging with complexity, not from oversimplifying things or forcing them into some pre-existing ideological box. And the Magic Mountain is a prime example of a work that embraces complexity and challenges us to think for ourselves.
Makes sense. But then they connect ambiguity tolerance to the ability to deal with hardship. How do those two things even relate?
They argue that how well we tolerate ambiguity is directly linked to how well we cope with difficult situations, how we endure suffering, and how we find meaning when things are tough.
So it's like a muscle. The more we exercise our ability to handle uncertainty, the stronger and more resilient we become. And they're saying the Magic Mountain can help us do that.
Exactly. They suggest that by engaging with complex and challenging literature, we actually train ourselves to become more resilient. It's like a mental and emotional boot camp, preparing us for life's inevitable curveballs.
Okay, I see the connection. But then they bring up these different psychological models, the inhibition model and the integration model. What are those, and how do they relate to this whole discussion?
They're basically talking about different ways people cope with negative thoughts and feelings. The inhibition model is all about suppressing or avoiding those negative experiences, trying to push them down and ignore them. The integration model, though, encourages us to acknowledge and process those difficult emotions, even find meaning in them.
So it's like the difference between trying to build a wall to keep the bad stuff out and actually facing our challenges head on, integrating those experiences into our understanding of ourselves and the world. And are they saying that the integration model fits better with this ambiguity tolerance thing we're talking about?
Exactly, because it recognizes that true resilience comes from facing our challenges, wrestling with tough questions, and finding a way to incorporate all our experiences, both good and bad, into a complete story about who we are. And that's one of the things that makes the Magic Mountain so powerful and enduring. It doesn't shy away from those difficult questions, it doesn't offer easy answers, but it does give us a framework for thinking about them in a more nuanced and sophisticated way.
Okay, I'm really getting a sense of just how deep and complex this novel is, but they go back to the idea of the Olympian narrator again, using Thomas Mann as an example. Didn't we already cover that?
They revisit it in the context of ambiguity tolerance and those postmodern challenges. They point out that this detached, all-seeing perspective that man uses allows him to create a world that's both super intricate and totally coherent. Every detail matters. Everything contributes to a larger meaning.
So it's like he's able to hold all that complexity and ambiguity in his mind and present it to us in a way that challenges us, but ultimately leaves us feeling satisfied. Like he's saying, hey, the world is a messy, complicated place, but there's beauty and meaning in it if you're willing to look for it.
Precisely. And they contrast this with a lot of contemporary writing that's more subjective and fragmented, where the focus seems to be more on the author's personal experiences than on creating a unified, meaningful narrative. Not that one is necessarily better than the other, but it's a different approach.
Right. So it's not about one being good and the other bad, but about different approaches, different goals. So are they saying that contemporary literature is just inherently flawed or less valuable than classic literature?
Not at all. They're just highlighting the difference between exploring personal experience and creating a narrative that speaks to something bigger, something beyond the individual.
Okay, I see the distinction they're making. So they're suggesting that the Magic Mountain, with its Olympian narrator and its grand scale, gives us a kind of perspective that's often missing in contemporary literature.
Exactly. And they connect this to the whole idea of a meaning crisis, suggesting that while it's understandable that we retreat into our own personal experiences when we feel like we've lost our bearings, that can also limit us. They're arguing that by engaging with works like the Magic Mountain works that grapple with the big questions and offer a more expansive view of the world, we can reconnect with those larger truths and find a sense of meaning that goes beyond our own individual lives.
Okay, I see how it all connects.
Mhm.
But they also bring up this fascinating point about how the structure of a text can actually influence how we think. What do they mean by that?
They're saying that reading a complex, layered text like the Magic Mountain actually trains our minds to think in a more nuanced and sophisticated way. It's not just about what the book says, it's about the mental effort it takes to decipher it, to make sense of how it's put together.
So it's like a workout, but for our brains.
Right. It's like learning a new language. When we immerse ourselves in the structure of a complex text, We're actually expanding our cognitive abilities, learning new ways to think.
And they're contrasting that with how passively we consume information in this digital age, where it's all about short, fragmented bits of content. It's like we're training our brains to think in sound bites and tweets and losing our ability to really engage with more complex ideas.
Exactly. They argue that this kind of passive consumption can lead to a kind of intellectual laziness, where we lose the ability to focus, think critically, and really engage with complex ideas.
So it's like we're filling our minds with junk food and we're missing out on the nutrients we need to be intellectually healthy. And the Magic Mountain is like that hearty, nutritious meal that can help us get back on track.
Exactly. It demands our attention, challenges us to think critically, and rewards us with insights that can really deepen our understanding of ourselves and the world.
Okay, I'm really starting to appreciate the value of reading challenging books like The Magic Mountain. But they also bring up that idea of vibe shift again, arguing that we're in the middle of a profound shift, a transformation, and that we need the wisdom of classic literature to help us navigate it.
Right, they're emphasizing how Goethe and Thomas Mann, they both lived through periods of massive upheaval, and their works reflect what it was like to go through those transformative times.
So they're saying even though the specific events might be different, the underlying human experiences, the search for meaning and purpose in a world that always seems to be changing, those are timeless and universal.
Exactly. They suggest that by really immersing ourselves in great literature, we can gain a deeper understanding of our own historical moment and find guidance for how to deal with the challenges we face.
Okay, I can see how this applies to our lives now. But they also connect it to the current political climate, arguing that all the polarization and division we're seeing is partly because of a lack of ambiguity tolerance and the inability to have respectful conversations with people who have different views.
It's a really important point. If we can't tolerate different perspectives, if we're always trying to force everything to fit into our own pre-existing boxes, then it becomes impossible to have real conversations or find common ground. And the Magic Mountain, with its complex characters and its exploration of all these different ideologies, it gives us a model for how to have those conversations.
So it's not about agreeing with everyone, but about being willing to listen, to try to understand, to see things from different perspectives. And they're saying literature can help us learn how to do that.
Exactly. It can help us cultivate intellectual humility, a willingness to learn and grow, and an appreciation for the beauty and complexity of human experience.
Okay, I'm really starting to see the power of literature in a new light, but they also emphasize that reading The Magic Mountain isn't about finding easy answers. It's about embracing the challenge, the discomfort, the ambiguity, and letting the experience change you. It's about understanding that the search for meaning is a lifelong journey, and the journey itself is just as important as the destination.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that's the real magic of the Magic Mountain. It doesn't give us all the answers, but it helps us ask better questions, think more deeply, and see the world in a more nuanced and complex way. And ultimately, it's that kind of thinking, that kind of engagement with the world that will allow us to navigate the challenges of our time and create a better future for ourselves and for future generations.
Okay, wow, that was a lot to take in. We
Yeah.
covered so much, from coagulated becoming and how the Magic Mountain reflects a pre-war world, to time, symbolism, and how it compares to both Faust and the Bible in terms of how we read and interpret them. But this YouTube discussion had so much more to say.
They did. And before we wrap up, it's worth exploring their thoughts on deviating from the path, the whole thing about woke ideology, and how psychological models of processing information relate to our ability to embrace ambiguity.
Okay, so we're back. And that whole idea of deviating from the path, it really stuck with me from that YouTube discussion. It felt almost like a warning. But what are they warning us about exactly?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. They bring up that Jordan Peterson quote, "You deviate from the path at your peril." But they're not saying we should just blindly follow tradition. It's more about recognizing this tension between respecting the wisdom of the past and also needing to adapt, to change with the times.
So it's like, yeah, we shouldn't just thoughtlessly follow the old ways, but we shouldn't just toss them out either. There might be something valuable there, something worth holding on to.
Right. They argue that certain patterns in how humans behave, certain fundamental truths about what it means to be human, they've lasted this long for a reason. And those patterns, those truths, might have some insights that can help us deal with the stuff we're facing today.
They use a really cool example talking about how early Christians, when they were printing stuff, they used both sides of the paper, and that had this unintended consequence. It actually shaped how we make and consume information even centuries later.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even small actions, things we might not think are important, can have these ripple effects that we might not even realize.
So it's like we're all part of this big chain of cause and effect. We have to be aware of the choices we make because they might have consequences we can't even imagine.
Exactly. And that connects to their critique of woke ideology. They argue that this tendency to view everything through a social justice and identity politics lens, it can sometimes make people rigid and intolerant, which actually hurts the very causes they're trying to support.
It's like they're trying to squeeze this complex, nuanced reality into a tiny, predefined box.
Mhm.
And that kind of rigidity, it can stifle creativity, innovation, even just thinking critically, can't it?
You got it.
Yeah.
They suggest it creates this atmosphere of fear where people are afraid to speak up or disagree with the dominant narrative. They contrast this with how open and ambiguous the Magic Mountain is, where different viewpoints are explored, debated, but there are no easy answers.
So it's like Thomas Mann is showing us a different way to engage with the world. One that's open to complexity, encourages us to think for ourselves, even if it makes us a bit uncomfortable.
Exactly, and they say this is essential for real progress and understanding. It's not about shutting down opposing views, it's about making space for different perspectives to be heard and considered, even if we don't agree in the end.
That makes a lot of sense. They also brought up those different psychological models for processing information, though. How does that fit into this?
Yeah, they contrasted two models. The inhibition model, which is all about suppressing or avoiding negative thoughts and feelings, and then the integration model, where you acknowledge and process those difficult experiences.
So it's like choosing between burying your head in the sand or facing your challenges head on. They're saying the integration model is the one that leads to more tolerance for ambiguity.
Exactly. Because it recognizes that real resilience, being able to bounce back from stuff, comes from facing those tough emotions, trying to understand them, and integrating them into how we see ourselves and the world. And they think that engaging with complex literature like The Magic Mountain, it helps us develop that integration mindset.
It's like we're training our minds to be more flexible, more adaptable, better able to deal with whatever life throws at us.
That's it. And this all loops back to The Magic Mountain as that right bracket to the modern era. It's a work that challenges us to face complexity head-on, embrace the unknown, and develop those mental and emotional skills we need to survive in a world that's constantly changing.
So it's not just about some guy hanging out in a sanatorium for 7 years. It's more like a guidebook for how to live in a world that's increasingly uncertain.
Exactly. That's why it's still relevant today, even though it was written over 100 years ago. The specific problems we face might be different, but those basic human things, that search for meaning, trying to adapt to change, those are timeless.
Okay, this deep dive has been really eye-opening, but before we finish, I want to come back to that original question. Does the Magic Mountain really work as a right bracket to the modern era?
Yeah, the big question. The YouTube folks we've been talking about, they didn't give a clear-cut answer, but they made some really interesting points.
It seemed like they agreed that the novel captures a very particular moment in time, that pre-World War I era, like a world on the edge of change. But they also said that the ending of the book, with Hans Castorp going off to the trenches, it doesn't feel like a clean break.
Yeah, and that's where that ambiguity comes in again. If the Magic Mountain represents that pre-war world, that world that was shifting but still somewhat stable, then the war is like falling off that mountain, a descent into chaos.
And they link that to the changes we're going through now, this feeling that we've entered uncharted territory, a world that's both exciting and scary, full of possibility but also danger.
Totally. It's like we've come down from that mountain of the pre-digital age into this new landscape. It's both familiar and totally strange, where the old rules don't work and we're still figuring things out.
So maybe the Magic Mountain doesn't perfectly close out the modern era, but maybe it gives us something even better, a bridge between that lost world and our own, a way to understand those human challenges that are always there, no matter what time period you're in.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's like Thomas Mann is saying, look, this is what it felt like to live through a period of massive change. These were the things people were afraid of, the hopes they held on to. Now you're facing your own version of that. What are you going to do?
Exactly. That's why it's so important to revisit these classic books. They're not just stories, they're like maps for navigating change, guides for understanding what it means to be human, reminders that we're not alone in wrestling with these big questions.
And they can help us develop those essential skills we've been talking about, tolerating ambiguity, thinking critically, finding meaning in the middle of complexity.
Those are definitely survival skills for the 21st century, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. So for those of you listening, what stands out to you about the Magic Mountain? Does this idea of it as a right bracket resonate with you? Or does it feel like something else entirely?
Here's a final thought. If that pre-war world is like a mountaintop, and the war represents those chaotic Flanders fields Hans Castorp ends up in, where are WE standing right now in 2025? Are we still down in those fields, or have we climbed to some new, maybe even higher peak? And what kind of challenges await us on this new terrain?
That's for you to think about. Hopefully, though, this deep dive has given you some tools and perspectives that will help you make that climb. Remember, it's not just about the destination, it's about the journey. And sometimes the most important lessons are the ones we learn along the way.